Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, there is the development of parts of a human heart in miniature. What's more, they beat. There is an increasing number of instances of people being poisoned using otherwise innocuous over-the-counter supplements. This includes vitamin D, melatonin, and more. Doctors who have been taken to task by medical boards are now trying to sue said boards, and the recognition of the precursors to RNA in the center of our galaxy. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with growing bits of the human body in miniature. Organoids, or miniature organs, are something that have been in use at least semi-regularly the last few years. The individual parts of an organ are somewhat older, or more accurately, the cells are somewhat older. We've been able to grow various tissues of various organs for quite a few decades now. The difficulty is getting them to function as intended. Cells alone can only tell you so much. This is why the creation of miniature myocardial cells, these are the muscle cells of the heart, that can beat, is rather important. It provides the means of creating a miniature model of how the heart pushes blood out of it and around the body. This would allow you to be able to target specific therapies for things like myocardial infarction, otherwise known commonly as a heart attack. Until now, there have been very few ways to get around this. Organs on a chip can be somewhat useful, but even they have limitations. We've already mentioned that cells alone aren't great, and the only alternative left after that is animal research. Rather obviously, that is a one-way trip for any animal involved. You need to take the heart out of the animal to study what the effects are. You can't just leave it in situ. Eventually, the animals will die. This takes away all of those problems and the ethical considerations. As with everything we've just mentioned, there is a rather significant caveat to the utility of these. They are a very limited demonstration or analog of that particular part of the heart, but the heart is more than just muscle. There is a complex tissue matrix in there that involves the myocardial cells, there are nerve cells, there's interaction between the brain and the heart to keep it beating regularly. There is obviously the flow of blood from the heart into the rest of the body and back again. There are various issues to do with how the rest of the body deals with blood flow, and how this has direct feedback to the heart and then impacts on what it does. These problems are typified by the fact that the entire organoid type structure has to be artificially stimulated with electrical shocks, very much like what a pacemaker does, except in this case, all they're able to study is how the layers of myocardial cells work. Still on the topic of hearts, but moving from the development of an artificial analog for a heart to real hearts, but ones that have been artificially modified using gene editing. These are hearts from pigs that are intended for transplants. We recently mentioned one of the individuals who very bravely volunteered to have one of these xenotransplants, that is a transplant from a non-human animal to a human. They had a heart transplanted from a pig that had been genetically modified to make it so the immune system would not recognize it, and unfortunately they died, and the exact circumstances of that death have not yet been announced. Where we go from there are two more such volunteers. Having said volunteer, we must add a caveat to that. Both of the individuals were brain dead. That is, they had no means of actually volunteering at the time, but they had agreed to take part in something like this. They were kept alive on ventilators, and their hearts continued to beat, and then were replaced. Given the kind of research that was being conducted Obviously, the individuals weren't kept alive for an extended period. In this case, it was 72 hours. At the end of that, they were allowed to pass on peaceably. What is less than peaceable is the impact of taking supplements in the wrong way. The example case studies we have for you first of all involve a man taking vitamin D. That by itself is not unusual. Unfortunately, he took 400 times the daily recommended dose. A lot of vitamin D. Unfortunately, it is possible to overdose on vitamin D. It's one of those supplements and nutrients that is relatively benign in small, regular doses. It can benefit you in slightly higher doses if you aren't getting enough from diet. Consuming too much will have some very obvious and relatively quick effects. He started vomiting, and vomiting quite aggressively for several months. The reason he was vomiting for so long is that the half-life of vitamin D is about 2 months. That means if you take 400 times the dose you're supposed to on day 1, by the time you get to the end of 2 months, you'll only have 200 times the dose left in you that you should have taken. At the end of 4 months, it'll be approximately 100 times. At 6 months, 50 times. At 8 months, 25 times. At 10 months, 12.5 times. At the end of a year after taking it, you'll be sitting on somewhere around 6 times the daily recommended dose. It's fortunate for this individual that he only had to sustain vomiting for 3 months. That didn't come without some costs though, notably his weight. He lost nearly 13 kilograms or 28 pounds. The irony of everything we've mentioned so far is what caused this particular scenario. It is the very fact that he was trying to take nutrients in order to help with his plethora of other health issues both present and in the past. He was told by a nutritional therapist to begin taking over-the-counter supplements. The variety of supplements he took included vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin C, vitamin B9, vitamin B2, vitamin B6, omega-3, and a variety of other vitamins, minerals, and so on. Even after vomiting started to occur regularly and at very high frequency, and continued for a long time, he continued to take the cocktail of vitamins and nutrients he'd been advised to consume. This would generally be a sign of correlation. I've begun taking said thing, and now I'm feeling unwell. Perhaps I should stop said thing. Or better yet, see a doctor. It's arguable that the only reason why his vitamin D levels dropped down to somewhere where he was no longer vomiting regularly was that he was put on IV fluids to get rid of as much vitamin D from his body as possible. And even after 2 months of that, his vitamin D levels were well above what they should have been. This is another instance where we should point out that nutritional supplementation is not necessary in the vast majority of cases. Most individuals gain no benefit from consuming any kind of nutritional supplement so long as they consume a regular, healthy diet. It's only those individuals who have sustained periods where their diet is deprived of specific nutrients, or have a very specific diet where a vast number of nutrients, minerals, and so on are omitted, that you need even consider it. Otherwise, you begin taking an excess quantity of the nutrients, vitamins, and minerals that you think you need but don't. This is true not just in relation to vitamins, nutrients, and minerals. There are other things that are consumed that are also in a similar category, and unfortunately are leading to similar consequences. The problem with this is not that people are doing something unnecessary and ultimately dangerous. Rather, they're doing something unnecessary, ultimately dangerous, and doing it to children. The most common example so far has been melatonin, and this is because during the pandemic, more people seem to be giving it to children and, as a result, causing an overdose in melatonin. Obviously, during COVID's most serious periods, there were good reasons to try and get into a regular healthy habit. For many people, this was trying to get to bed at a normal time and consistent time. For many, this was very difficult. The disruption to their lives, the associated stress, and so on, led to impacts that caused insomnia. Melatonin is considered a natural supplement that helps with sleep. There is limited evidence that yes, it is possible that it could help. But again, it's a question of, do you need it? Will it address the underlying cause? And is that actually what's wrong? If a shortage of melatonin is not responsible for what's happening, then giving more may lead to exactly what the Poison Control Center has observed: a significant increase in the number of reported cases of melatonin poisoning. We can say that this is closely tied to the use of melatonin and possibly to COVID, because the biggest increase occurred between 2019 and 2020. Prior to this, melatonin in all categories only accounted for 2.25% of all reported poisonings. By 2020, it had gone up to almost 5%. That's more than a doubling in a year or so. Unfortunately, melatonin is, like so many other things, a supplement and therefore not anywhere near as well regulated. Regulation of something you're going to consume and put in your body like this is very important, especially when it has a very targeted effect and can be very potent. This is why there is oversight, whether that is the FDA or the equivalent in your particular country. Your country likely does have a medical board as well, and this medical board exists to oversee doctors as they practice. It ensures that what they do is in line with best practice, isn't something terribly wrong, and is hopefully evidence-based. This is where an Oregon pediatrician called Paul Thomas is going to enter the story for us. He's bringing a lawsuit against his state medical board because they believe he's providing substandard care, being an antivaxxer, and therefore suing them in order to stop them from chastising him and possibly taking further action. Unfortunately, he is the sort of individual who believes vaccines cause autism. No, they don't. Based on this and other activities he has been involved in, the board chose to suspend his license on an emergency basis. Their rationale is that he had involved himself in conduct that has breached the standard of care and has placed the health and safety of many patients at serious risk of harm. There were 8 counts of this. Despite this, he was reinstated in June 2021, but with limitations. These limitations were there to fundamentally allow him to do his job, given the massive crapshoot that was COVID-19, but ensure that in doing so, he was able to provide adequate care that was in the best interest of the patients, not his tinfoil hat theories. Keep in mind that he was allowed to go back to work in the medical field in a limited capacity in June 2021. Near the end of November 2021, an amended complaint was put in against him regarding unprofessional or dishonorable conduct, making false or misleading statements regarding the efficacy of the licensee's treatments, repeated negligence and gross negligence in the practice of medicine, willfully violating any provision of this chapter, knowingly making a false statement or representation on a matter, failing to comply with a board request, and failing to report an adverse action. It's surprising that they didn't also throw the kitchen sink at him. Come June 30th of 2022, Dr. Paul Thomas has brought a lawsuit against that same medical board in order to fundamentally prevent them from acting on those allegations. The article that we've drawn a lot of this initial information from goes into a lot more detail on the challenges that the complaint and lawsuit faces. Notably that they're trying to challenge a government body acting under very clear legal protections, and that they would need to find not only had they acted incorrectly, but that those legal protections did not apply. One notable example from the article of his accused malpractice involves an unvaccinated child who was infected with tetanus when 6, spent 2 months in the ICU, and on being discharged was referred to a homeopath with recommendations of fish oil supplements, phosphatidylene sane, and that there was no indication that vaccination was discussed or recommended. Tetanus is something that can be vaccinated against, homeopathy will do nothing for, and we see no rational reason why fish oil supplements would help in any particular way. Finally, the last news item we have for you this week has actual science and evidence behind it, and that is the detection of precursors for RNA in the center of our galaxy. RNA is a relatively simple molecule. That is, it is complex enough to give rise to our life, replicate, and all manner of other things. But at its most fundamental and basic level, the parts that make it up are actually quite simple. Toxic in isolation, but simple. When you combine these in the appropriate ratios and in the right circumstances, they can then lead to RNA. At the same time that you have the necessary constituents for RNA, that can then lead to the emergence of DNA, and then protein. Eventually, with these swirling, coalescing molecules, and millions upon millions and millions of years, it can give rise to life. That's where the identification of these compounds, particularly neutriles in the center of our galaxy, can be so very useful. There are 2 things that are going to emerge from this. One, it can help us predict where we might possibly find life. That is, where, other than Earth, based on this information, there would have been enough time and the necessary materials and circumstances for RNA to occur and then gradually turn into life itself. Second is how life could have emerged on Earth. Well, an explanation that doesn't involve a unknown being deciding to make 2 people populate the entire planet by yanking the ribcage out of one. Of course, this research is somewhat speculative in its nature. Admittedly, most such research is going to be for the most part. What we can look at is how it matches with other research into the discovery of very early preliminary building blocks of life on asteroids and similar celestial bodies that have originated from similar parts of space. And if these origin points are the more advanced or further along the developmental cycle from the area that's being looked at in this study, it is possible that it could eventually form the necessary products for RNA. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.